Hi everyone, this is Dr Raquel Butler from Integrated Veterinary Therapeutics.
And Sophie Vandenberg from Equine Postulate. And we welcome you to the Equine Functional Posture Podcast, your ultimate source for insights into the influence of functional posture on biomechanics, health, and overall well-being of horses.
Whether you're a seasoned equestrian, an equine professional, or simply a horse enthusiast, this podcast is designed to help you understand the critical aspects of functional posture.
Tune in each week as we discuss practical tips, delve into expert interviews, and explore the latest research in the impact of functional posture on equine anatomy, physiology, movement, and more.
Let's create a world where we empower our horses to be in a mental, emotional, and physical balance. Today we're talking about growth plates and exploring what they are. This is going to be a two-part episode. So in this episode, we're going to explore growth plates and their influences, and then in part two, we're going to talk more specifically about loading growth plates in young horses. Growth plates matter for horse owners because they're important considerations in relation to skeletal development, as well as injury risk and appropriate training.
Growth plates build the bones that we need. And it sounds very simple when you say it like that, but growth plates and bones are complex structures. So if you were to ask what is a bone and what role does it play in the skeleton, bones are there as an anchoring framework. The combination of the skeleton and the arrangement of soft tissues and muscles, this organizes the horse's body. There's an appropriate level of tension in lots of different directions. And this is the reason that us and horses and all animals can get up and walk around versus being a pile of bones and muscle and tissue on the floor. And when we think about bones, there is a growth phase of the bone, and that's what we're discussing today. So could you tell us, Raquel, what is a growth plate?
Yeah, so a growth plate is also known as a physis or the epiphyseal plate, and it's the center of ossification. So it's basically where it starts with a cartilage matrix, which we'll go into the zones in a minute, but it starts with cartilage and then the cartilage becomes the hardened bone. And it's really interesting because when you take a x-ray of a puppy, that's when you really see the effects of growth plates, because they look like they're like bones sitting on a plate, like, you know, so they look like they're just these bones sitting in placement, but there's just black in between them, and there's like a lot of space in between the bones when you look at a puppy especially. And I've got Finn at the moment, and he's 5, nearly 6 months old Great Dane, and I'm really seeing the effects of, you know, nutrition and loading, and especially, you know, how much play he does in a day on his growth plates, because they will swell and thicken and get inflamed related to what he's doing. So it's the place at which the growth occurs in the bones. It's generally at the end of the bone. It is in all bones, but it's a little different in the skull, in the organization of it in the skull. There can be more than one growth plate, like at the end of a bone. For example, at the top of the femur, like there's a couple of growth plates at the end. And so it's, you know, growing, I guess what we're saying is like bones don't grow from the middle, they grow from the ends. And they're sitting in between the long central shaft of the bone, which is called the diaphysis, and the end of the bone. Epi means end, so the epiphysis. So you've got the cartilage cells, the blood supply, you've got an extracellular matrix that kind of fills in the gap between the cells. It's much more flexible and much less mineralized than the rest of the bone, and so it's really vulnerable to stress and injury. So, can you just talk about the 3 main zones of the growth plates to give people an idea of how they develop?
Yep. So there's the resting zone, and you've got cartilage cells, so chondrocytes and extracellular matrix. And in this little zone, this provides cells to the growth zone when required. So then you've got the proliferative zone, And here the chondrocytes are actively dividing and they're producing more chondrocytes, and these line up in columns, and that pushes the bone ends further apart. The structure of the pattern is very important because this provides strength and support to the bone, and if we disrupt this process, then it's going to affect growth. And then we have the hypertrophic zone, where these chondrocytes enlarge, and then these prepare the surrounding matrix for mineralization and are creating more stability in the matrix. So then you've got calcification and ossification, where the blood vessels, so those are the three main zones also, the resting, proliferative, and hypertrophic zone. And then we also have calcification and ossification. So the blood vessels bring in osteoblasts to replace the cartilage with bone, and then these mature into osteocytes or bone cells. So as a summary of this overall process of having your three zones of development, calcification and ossification, there's a cartilage template. So cartilage cells divide and they grow in a structured way. These mineralize, blood vessels come in, and bone-forming cells replace the cartilage cells, and then you get a lengthening bone. So that's bone growth. Raquel, what does it mean when these growth plates are opening, closing, or closed? Because these are terms that we hear, but they don't have a lot of relevance unless you understand these processes that we're talking about.
Yeah, so when a growth plate is open, that's like the time at which there's active growth happening. So there's more of the cartilaginous components within the growth plate, and they're actively changing within that space. When we talk about it closing, it means that there's more calcification present in the area. So you've got more mineralization of the growth plate, and it's starting to, so if we took an x-ray of it at that time, it wouldn't just be all black. It would start to have some white because you've got actual bone cells, within that. And then when they're closed, that defines as the bones being fully developed in terms of the growth plate. It doesn't mean bones are fully developed in general, so you're going to kind of talk a bit more about that, but it means that the growth from the actual growth plate in terms of the length from that perspective has completed. So, and when they're open, they're much more susceptible to, strains and torsions especially. And so I'll just tell a little story about how old was she? I think she was about 12 months old, this little mare, and I knew her as a foal, and she was a really nice little foal. I knew her conformation, I knew her body structure, and then all of a sudden one day she roached through her lumbar spine, and the owner was like, what the hell is wrong with her? And she would not let me near her stifles, like absolutely no way that she was letting me near her stifles. And, we tried to figure out what had happened, and actually took us a while to figure out. And then the owner realized after we'd been treating her for a while, I'm like, these stifles are so sore, like something must have happened. And anyway, she figured out that she'd put her in with the older horses and they had chased her. And so she'd been stopping and twisting and turning and trying to get away from them. And that incident had created significant inflammation in her stifle growth plates, because we're going to talk about like stages of closures in a minute, but those stifles are really prone to twisting. And so she got them x-rayed, I think it was a few months later, and the vets actually said, oh no, like the stifles are fine. But when you looked at the growth plate line, there was little spurs on the growth plate line, and the growth plate looked more closed than what it should be for her, what you'd expect it to be for her age. Like it looked like there was more calcification, and this is what can happen. Like we can kind of change this when there's inappropriate loading, and we're going to talk about all the other influences on that, and it can be difficult to know, when a growth plate has been inflamed, because an X-ray is just showing like bony remodeling. It doesn't show growth plate inflammation, to the extent that could be there. Like, there are telltale signs that we can look for, but it's not, it's not always that simple to diagnose that you've had a growth plate inflammation. So, even after those growth plates close, we still have changes within the bone. So bones will still remodel. It's what's called Wolff's Law, and what that means is that bone changes in response to the forces placed upon it. So, the muscle forces, the ground forces, the loading forces, all of those things will continue to develop bone in terms of like its thickness and its shape. But the actual growth in terms of length has finished when the growth plates close. So you'll still get like changes in density and the architecture of the bone, and they're going to adapt for the life of the horse. However, it slows as horses get older, because the bone turnover, like the cell turnover, is much, much slower in older horses than what it is in younger horses, which is why, like we'll talk about this in the next episode, why that loading is so important in young horses. So one of the questions that people often ask, do the growth plates really close from the hoof upwards, or do they all, close at the same time?
So the answer is yes, they do close from the hooves upwards. They don't, we don't hit a magical age, just like people in our teens, and all of our growth plates close across our body at the same time. And it's honestly very fascinating when you think about it, because the pedal bone, which was the bone inside the horse's hoof capsule, finishes growing in terms of the growth plate in the last stages of gestation. That means that while the foal is in utero, you are already at the stage where the growth plate is closing. And so we're going to go right sort of from the hoof upway to the body. But when you reach the skull, we're looking at the growth plate's not closing until 6 plus. It's an incredible timeline of these changing. So when you think about the pastern, this is, so in the pastern, you've got the P1, P2, and P3. And so the P3 is that coffin bone we're talking about. It's inside the hoof capsule, finishing in the late stages of gestation. And then your pastern bones, the short pastern, the one in the middle, is the growth plates are closing from birth to 6 months. And then that long pastern between 6 months to 1 year. And so, some comments that I would have about that are how important it is to be thinking about hoof balance and hoof alignment, and also pastern alignment, and the health of these structures during that time. Because if you've got bone that is responding and growing, it's in such a vulnerable state for the way that it grows to be influenced by its position and the loading being placed upon it. So if you've got foals running around and even in that 6 months of growth, if you've got young foals on very soft ground and they're not wearing their foot away, you can have a group of foals that have a very, very long toes and very underrun heels, in their first early months of life. So you're changing the tension and the pull coming through the tendons that come around underneath those long pastern bones, and even just just the loading going through them, because there isn't a more upright form of the foot. That's just one example. If you've got changes in medial lateral balance, or you've got a limb deviation, all of these things are going to influence those pastern bones. So, and then if you go a bit further up the leg, you've got the cannon bone. And so the growth plates are closing between 8 months and a year and a half. And so that, during that timeline, there are There are lots of things that horses are doing during that age. They are beginning to sprint around like crazy animals. It's not common that we're getting on horses that are 8 months to 1.5 years old.
Unless they're
At the upper end, at the upper end,
horse.
on a Western, if you're going in a 2-year-old futurity, you've been riding that horse 6 months ago. So these horses are, again, if you're adding load and then you're maybe using an arena, you're twisting and turning, you're going to be influencing those cannon bones. And then if you come up again to the carpus, so that's the knees, that's a collection of little carpal bones are inside the horse's knee, and they're going to be ossifying. Sorry, the growth plates are closing between 1.5 to 2.5 years. And so a lot of horses are being ridden in this stage of life. And you had some comments actually about knees before and how, sometimes x-rays aren't representative of what's happening inside the bones.
Yeah, well, it's just recognizing that, under 2.5-ish years that the carpus is still growing. And, I think the compressive forces can be quite a thing to consider in that time, because sometimes you will see carpuses under x-ray where there's like a curvature to the carpal bones, and I think that's it's related to the loading, and potentially related to, how much loading they've done in that growth period of time. And so, we will talk about this more in part 2, but it's just something to consider that the knees are, still open and at 2.5.
Yeah. And then if you keep going up the limb, you've got the radius, ulnar, and tibia. So these are the bones that are between the knee and the elbow, and also the hock and the stifle. So, we've just talked about the cannon bone down, and that's going to be the same in the front and the hind limb. And then once you get above the hock and the knee, the bones begin to change. So the radius and ulnar in the front limb, the tibia in the hind limb. And so these growth plates are closing between 2 and 3 years old. And so if you're doing a lot of twisting, turning, loading, all kinds of different things, these are bones that are really going to be influenced, especially because at that age, they start moving around more themselves anyway, and because the lower limb has become a more solid structure, then you're really looking at how the body and the posture at this stage, they're going to be maintaining the alignment. At the very beginning we talked about the fact that the skeleton is held in form by the soft tissues, and so your posture is important the whole time, but here we're really thinking about, your elbow, your shoulder, your hock, your stifle, the way that the body moves and the posture and what you ask of the body is going to influence the torsion and the strain. They're also getting heavier. There's a lot, the horses themselves are getting heavier. So, anything that we add to that is going to be extra loading. And then if we talk about the humerus and the femur, so the humerus is in between the elbow and the shoulder, and the femur is between the hip and the stifle. And these growth plates are closing between 3 and 3.5 years. And then above that, you've got the scapula and the pelvis. So the scapula being the shoulder blade, and the pelvis, of course, is your ilium. It's going right through that upper hindquarters of the horse. And they are not closing at the growth plates until 3.5 to 4 years, which is, it's nearly unheard of to be finding horses that aren't being ridden at this stage. And that's when we're asking them to load, we're asking them to even begin collection, and we're putting a saddle on them as well. So, these are really, valuable areas that we're influencing. Did you want to explain the hocks and spine?
Yeah, I think that it's just important to consider with the hocks, 4 years old, we really want to make sure that the way that those hocks are being loaded is in the best biomechanically supported way. And, there's comments that the distal hock joints don't matter, and that we can, that they confuse, and then it's not really that important to biomechanics. I tend to disagree with that. I think the small movements in bone are actually more important than some of the big movements in terms of, correct biomechanics and loading. So, yeah, hocks, I really think, there's a whole reason that hocks come under so much strain, but part of it is this later growth, as well as, postural support and hoof balance and all of those things that are going to increase the load on the hocks. And then the spine can be up to 6 or more years, depending on we're going to go into what influences growth times, but depending, especially on the breed and the height of the horse. And the base of the neck, which is the area that in a lot of horses is not well supported, like not posturally well supported, it's the last to close. So like C6, 7 area. And, often by this stage, the horses have had a lot of loading and a lot of life. And especially if they've had compressive forces in terms of a horizontal force, so like stopping quickly, and this can happen just in the paddock, then those growth plates come under a lot of strain, or pullback, in either direction. So a pullback force or a sudden stopping force, they could cause a lot of damage to the growth plates in the spine and specifically in the base of the neck. So all of these times can vary by about 6 months or so. It really depends on a number of factors. And, we need to, just consider these when we're thinking about what we're doing with horses and their growth. And then also, how do we tell that they're closed? It can be pretty difficult. Like, an X-ray can be useful in that sense because you can see the calcification of the growth plate, and that that the area where the growth plate would sit is fully white and fully calcified. You can kind of go off age and just look, like often you can just look at a horse and they have a look about them when they're kind of fully grown versus when they still look a bit lanky and immature. But you can't be sure just from looking at them whether they finish growing or not. I do feel like when I'm treating horses, they feel different from a treatment perspective. It's like I remember treating this horse years ago, and he had some significant lumbar discomfort, and I think maybe he was 2 or 3 when we started treating him, and I think he was fusing through his lumbar, and there was just a lot of discomfort. And then all of a sudden, at one point, I think she was riding him, she turned him out for a bit. His body just changed. It felt like it had set, and his responses to treatment and the way his body felt, and it just changed. It's like felt different to me when I was treating him. So you can get a sense of that. But we have to realize that even when the growth plates close, we still have the bone remodeling, changes in mineralization of the bone, changes in muscle forces, tension, muscle development, motor control. And so even when, you've got the growth, we've talked about the growth plates have finished growing, we've still got a lot of opportunities to influence the horse's function. So in terms of that, what are the influencing factors on growth plates that we need to think about?
Yeah, so there's plenty, especially in the growing horse. You've got hormones are important. Breed, tall and large horses, so warm bloods and draft horses might take a bit longer than your smallies. Maybe there might be like a 6-month difference. Genetics are going to influence them definitely. If you've had your parent is a little bit earlier, a little bit later, that's always going to affect you. Gender, So males generally close later, but not by a huge amount, but at least 6 months. You've also got
nutrition. So that one's important. In terms of nutrition, you want to know that there's a balanced mineral and energy ration for the horse, that they have good quality protein, but that the amount is controlled. And their mineral balance is really important. So the calcium to phosphorus ratio and the trace minerals, the copper and zinc, are really important. And you want to avoid grain and ensure that the young horses have a forage-based nutrition, but that they're balanced in terms of calcium, phosphorus, and copper and zinc. And so it's really important not to underfeed them or overfeed them, because both of those will have a significant influence on the growth plates, and also to avoid both deficiency of minerals, calories, proteins, and excess, because both of those will have long-term implications on soundness. And, it's worth having a nutritionist come in and just have a look at your young horse diets at the different stages of their growth. Like we did a podcast with Erica Goff just on general horse nutrition, but young horse nutrition is vitally important, and I highly recommend that you speak to a qualified equine nutritionist to make sure that you have got a balanced diet. Like, a lot of the pelleted feeds are not sufficient. We don't feed enough of them to provide the minerals that the horse needs. And so often, you do want to make sure that that's balanced. That's going to have a massive impact on your horse's longevity, performance, and injury risk as they grow up. What else can have an influence on those growth plates?
Management. So this is probably something we'll really dive into in the part 2, but what we do with them, the surfaces that they're on, how we manage their weight, how we manage, everything about their lifestyle, and just the factors, are we being targeted in both observing and seeing how they're developing and adjusting for them? And that always also happens on an individual level. So, horses are individuals just as a basis, but also they're going to have different things that happen to them. They slip differently, they run differently. You're always going to have influencing factors occurring to just about every horse. Every horse has a story. Every horse has, we've all had trips and slips and falls. So, being able to read that horse as an individual and then adapt your management to make sure that we're accommodating them for them to have as healthy growth plates and then bones as much as possible.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the problems that horses can get is fasciitis. And fasciitis, like, that's Finn, not a horse, but a Great Dane. He gets quite regular little bouts of fasciitis because he overdoes it, and I can't always stop him from jumping off the hay. And so he'll jump from the top. And also playing with Abby, our other Kelpie. Like, it's better to have controlled exercise, but sometimes it's not possible. And especially, with horses, because they're running around in the paddock and they can do crazy things. And so they can get fasciitis, and that can be caused by, abnormal loading stresses, such as like hard ground or excessive exercise. But it also can be caused by rapid growth, nutritional imbalances, if they've got an excess in calorie intake, if they're overweight, and they have an excess body condition, that has quite a negative effect on the growth plates, as well as like what their conformation is and how it's loading the growth plates. If they do have a really crooked leg, for example, then that's going to have a significant effect on how that bone grows. And then the biggest thing is, one of the big things that we can control is hoof care. And so not having frequent hoof care from a young age has a significant influence on the growth plates, and that's something we can control. And it should be definitely no more than like 6 weekly as the horse is growing, but for some horses they need it more frequently depending on the balance of their growth and the balance of their posture. So fasciitis is an inflamed growth plate. You might notice that they've got heat, pain, swelling over the joint. Sometimes the joint just looks more pronounced in its or tighter. And then they can have things like lameness associated with that. And if you're noticing any of these, you need to contact the vet and have a chat to them about management and, potentially take an x-ray to see what's going on and whether there's any other underlying developmental diseases kind of happening there as well that could be influencing the stresses on the growth plate. Yeah, so in terms of developmental diseases, things like OCD, osteochondritis dissecans, that affects the cartilage health over the joint. They can also get annular limb deformities, flexural deformities, and if you notice that you've got a young horse and it's become like stiff, it looks uneven in its limb growth, it might have become a bit reluctant to move, could see some joint swellings or limb deviations that have suddenly changed, or they're getting rapid changes in growth, you're best to investigate these early to create a management plan. Otherwise, you're going to have long-term effects of those. So it's really important to get on top of that. So how do you look after your horse's growth plates?
So in caring for them, we just talked about like what you would provide. So adequate nutrition, you'd provide adequate types of movement, services, etc. But what we want to avoid is repetitive work on firm ground. Horses, their body is pretty bloody heavy. A good run around the paddock for them is sufficient to load the bones with stimulation. Stimulation is still needed because it develops in response to the loading upon it. We also want to avoid high-speed work before we've done the conditioning for it. So you're always going to be asking too much of the bones and joints if you haven't prepared the body on a bony and soft tissue level to support that kind of work. Sharp turns and circles. This is, putting a lot of torsion through the bones is going to strain the growth plates or stress the growth plates. And also inappropriate recovery time. They are vulnerable parts of the bone. You've got the chondrocytes that are dividing and producing more. They're stacking, they're creating columns in the bone. We don't want to be loading. It really needs recovery time to be able to continue to grow and to grow well. And to make sure that they don't close early. We're probably going to talk about that more in part 2 of this podcast. I think that there'll be a lot of value for people if they want to learn about the application of the concepts we're talking about now, like what should we be doing in terms of how we're going to manage our young horses? How can I tell if I need to do more or do less? And also, what ages? This is something that comes up a lot, but what are the influencing factors of whether I could be doing more or less with my horse? And what are the ages that we should be doing more, less, the same? So other things we want to do are monitor for growth spurts and adjust workload so that we aren't asking too much of them during those phases. We don't want to ignore swellings around the joints, either over the joint or over the growth plate. So the growth plates are just next to the joint in the actual bone. We want to pay a lot of attention to hoof balance. That's very important. It is something that affects the whole limb and the upper body. And we also want to make sure that our nutrition is on point for growth, work, and age. And again, just to reiterate, it's really worth it to have a nutritionist consult if you have one foal, and to use that information to inform you if you have more than one. So it's a great investment. And then how would you think about starting to create a functional supportive posture with relation to horse growth plates?
Yeah, it's really important to create, the benefit of a functional posture for the growth is the most important thing. You can just getting them to grow in the best balance that they can, making sure that they, it'll reduce their injury risk as well. They'll have better coordination, better balance. Utilizing things like feeding positions, which we've done a podcast on, to create posture in the paddock and stop like the big split stance in foals, and help to promote as balanced growth as we can. Regular body work to support balanced growth of the body and rectify any issues, if they have had a bit of a slip and a slide in the paddock, picking that up before it's started to change the loading on the bone. So I remember years ago, I was treating a horse that had an injury. He was an 18-month-old colt, and he'd had a shoulder injury. And the owners had never had body work done on their young horses before. So they'd had it on their ridden horses, but they'd never had it on any young horses. And the injury was the injury, but what they said they noticed was how differently he grew compared to what they'd had in the past. They're like, he's a big horse, but they're like, he just grew in much more balanced way, and he didn't go through like the gangly, awkward stage as much. And I've definitely noticed that, like, when a horse looks awkward and they're a bit bum high, or they're going through a growth phase, it's actually a really good time to treat them. And just because the muscles are trying to lengthen, because the bones, especially if they've had a quick growth phase and the bones have grown, but the muscles are still having to adapt to the changes in bone length. So that's where like good quality, qualified body work can really help that growth process, and just also pick up any problems before they become a problem, and support the bones to stay in their best possible alignment. And then part of that functional posture, which I know we've like said this so many times already, but the hoof balance is absolutely integral in that process, and making sure that they are regularly trimmed and balanced to support balanced growth. So that's really important. Creating a functional posture from a young age will set your horse up for life. So functional posture is not just for ridden horses or older horses. It's like, do it from the start. And we have young horses in our functional posture course that come in at, well, I'm not sure what the youngest is that we've had, but I know we've definitely had people who've changed what they're doing with their foals and their young horses. So I think at the moment we've got some 2-year-olds in there. So super important to create a functional posture. So what are your takeaways in terms of growth plates?
Just to be mindful that they close at different times, and that there are many influencing factors on the health of the growth plate. And we're never going to be perfect, but we're just trying to do our best to decrease the stresses that we place on them, and that we support them as best we can with the right level of nutrition, and movement and care, and making sure that we try and balance them as best as possible, and that we have a very important part to play in protecting them. We kind of think of things that happen in the body as a physiological process, like the tooth erupts, the hoof grows, it does this, it does that. But we, the fact that there is a law called Wolff's Law, that the bone develops and models based on the loading placed upon it means that we have a lot of influence, more than we think we do, and we can help protect them. Next one, of course, nutrition services feet, mindfulness, awareness, and care in the way that we use those and that we care for them. Appropriate loading. So how are we developing, riding, and working these young horses? We're going to go into that much more in part 2. So definitely tune in. Whether you have a young horse or you want to know more about the topic, you're curious, very valuable. What else? What other takeaways?
Yeah, I think that is very important what you said there, that we do have a very important part to play, and it's not just a matter of letting the horse grow and it'll be what it'll be. Like, we can significantly influence the quality of growth and the way that, it leads to the rest of the longevity of their life. So yeah, take that responsibility seriously and utilize that to create the best horse that you can. And yes, there's lots of things that are unavoidable, but the more knowledge that you have, the earlier that you can pick up like signs that the growth plates are under stress, then the better outcomes that you're going to have. So thank you for joining myself, Dr. Raquel Butler and Sophie Vandenberg, in today's podcast. Enjoy your horse time. Please subscribe to the Equine Functional Posture podcast so you don't miss our weekly episodes. And give us a 5-star rating so we can share more valuable insights. Reach out with any listener requests for topics you'd like us to hear us talk about. And if you're a business aligned with our mission, become a sponsor of the podcast.
And we'll see you in the next exciting episode.